Welcome to the Live from America podcast. This is Hatem. No Noam today. He have some kind of interview that he's so proud of, and I'm sure it's shitty interview. And he left this show for some shitty interview, but that's Noam. No, just kidding. It's probably a good interview. But our guest is a great friend. One of the guests that I always say like it's great to have because you can just chat like you're chatting with your best friend, and he happens to be one of my good friends. MSNBC legal analyst Danny Cevallos is here. Hello, Danny. Great to have you again and see you.
Hatem, I am so honored that at least you, my friend, did not abandon me, unlike that Noam who has obviously chosen some other journalist over me to interview. How am I not more important than whoever this journalist is, Hatem?
No, it's the other way around. Somebody is interviewing Noam.
Oh, I
So
see.
that's
I
why he was
see.
like he's excited because nobody really want to talk to him. But now he
Well,
has
that's a
somebody.
good reason. And listen, everyone knows I'm kidding. I got to tell you, I just was at the Olive Tree, and I couldn't can't plug this place enough. I know it's Noam's place, but man, I had the greatest time. It is really the big one of my favorite secret things to do in New York that nobody knows about is go to the Olive Tree. They got great food, and you see, the scene in the back that you see in all the HBO shows. You see the comics table. I'm such a comedy fan that I'm so familiar with that table, and to see it when you bring a friend is just the coolest thing. So Noam was great. Unfortunately, you couldn't make it. I was a last minute thing, but Noam was just a wonderful host as always.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the thing is, like with the olive tree, like you know the right way because a lot of people will go to the comedy cell, watch the show, and leave. The olive tree with the action is happening,
I
and
agree.
yeah, and it's funny like because during my whole time, my friendship with Noam, my work in there, all this, there's so many TV shows and radio shows and other shows and podcasts now. We try to base their show based on the olive tree to catch that, and they just
Yep.
weren't able to,
Yep.
because the magic is too much. The conversation, like you can go for one table, like you can have people like, and it seems like everybody like hang out there is kind of cool. Like you'll have the best journalists, the best, thinkers, comedians, everybody, and we just talk about everything. I feel bad for people that don't hang out there and realize how great it is.
Well, yeah, here's the way I see it. I mean, first of all, I go in there, I'm a complete nobody, and I run into guys like Dan Natterman and Noam's there, and it's hugs, and everyone's just the nicest. But then you also have the chance of seeing like someone who's a huge name, or even some, comics. I mean, like I've said a million times, I'm a huge comedy fan, so I see some folks that I just think are funny people, and it is a tremendous place to go. And for the price of a couple drinks and some appetizers you can have a real New York experience. In my view, even better than being downstairs at the show. I know that may be heresy to say that, and I'm sorry, Noam, but I just love going upstairs. It's fun.
I agree with you, and I think one of the reasons, and I say that to Noam all the time, that it wasn't been able to be captured in a TV show or movies, even though it tried a lot, is the sense of humor is even better upstairs, but it's not a
Yep.
TV sense of
Yep.
humor, and
Yep.
people like are just relax and do what they, but like you say, you can be sitting down and next to you like 2 weeks ago, you're sitting there and it's Bradley Cooper and filming a movie there, and everybody's,
Yep.
just it's insane,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
just FYI. When I first met you, that first interview was just me and you, no Noam, you know?
Right.
When we first met, and I kept telling Noam, it's like, you got to meet this guy. And I remember when he first met you, it's like, okay, they keep telling me about this Danny Cevallos, and then he became a huge fan. Everybody loves you because you're
Oh,
very,
that's great.
uh,
That's great. Well,
well
I'll tell
known.
you, I was so excited and intimidated the first time I came to because we used to do it in person upstairs at the Comedy Cellar,
Yep.
way upstairs. And there were all these, there were usually a lot more comics, younger comics who would be there. And they all had these great zingers. And it was a really, really challenging room to be in, especially because I'm like the straight man. I don't have any jokes. So I was just talking about the Constitution. But again, just it's been so fun. I know this is turning into a love fest, but really, just it's a lot of fun, and it's great to see you because you're right. In the early days, it was just you and me at least once.
Yeah, 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 definitely. So let's dive into it. There's so much to talk about. But first, I usually you're one of the guests that I let you pick the topics because you're like in the court all the time. But first, congrats, you have a big win for your company.
A big what? Oh, you're talking about? Yes, I posted. We just had a client. I was representing the former governor of the Virgin Islands. This is all public record now. and they were sued. He and a bunch of other officials in the VI were sued by a bunch of alleged victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and we were able to get the case thrown out of at least the Southern District of New York. Whether it survives in some other form remains to be seen. But yes, very, very. The team is very pleased.
Congrats. So, first question, and then I'll let you tell us what's happening right now. The leaked messages between the defense minister and all that, when it was leaked to the journalist, when he was added by mistake, I always wonder this. It was added by mistake to the chain of messaging, right?
Mhm.
If he had reported this or published it, would he be in trouble legally?
So that's a tricky issue because if he was added consensual, if he wasn't sneaking in, if somebody willingly added him without deception, then you really it's going to be a difficult thing to argue that somehow the journalist is in trouble or on the hook. And the other challenging thing is that the administration is taking the position that, hey, the stuff that was communicated wasn't really that secret to begin with. Well, if they say that, then it's going to be difficult for them to later on say, hey, you published the secret stuff that we said isn't secret. So that's going to be a bit of a problem too. All in all, this thing is a big mess. And it raises all kinds of, what you find also, and I've been hearing from experts is that I've heard in some interviews, even the interviewer begins with sort of the assumption that Signal and all these other apps are just terribly, terribly unsecure. And it turns out, at least according to the subject matter experts, that not only are they pretty secure, but there are at least the war in Ukraine, for example, is largely being conducted over another similar app called Telegram, which I know you're sort of an international man of mystery. I'm sure you're aware of Telegram, Hatem, but maybe
Yeah.
Americans aren't quite as familiar with it. But I've learned over the last few days that these apps maybe are pretty secure. But then again, for every expert you can find to say that they're secure, you certainly can find one to say that it's not secure enough and probably not secure enough for national secrets or battle plans that are being communicated. But I got to tell you, I mean, and I've talked about this with my wife, who's an investigative journalist. It's crazy to think that, some of these, that people may be communicating national security secrets while they're at the grocery store on their phone, as opposed to, and someone made the argument that a lot of these people have skiffs. They have the facilities in their own basement that they can go down and make a very, very secure communication. But it's interesting that these high level officials fall victim to the same thing we all do, which is, as a criminal defense lawyer in the modern era, we put so much in typed word as opposed to phone calls that it creates evidence and things that can be hacked. But that's the price of efficiency. It's so much easier to send a text message. It's so much easier to use a messaging app than to pick up the phone or use a skiff or use some, top secret facility that you have to go to. That everybody does it, and it sounds crazy that our Secretary of Defense may be doing it, but I guess that's the reality we live in.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know why they don't have their own app thing, because I remember
Right.
Visa one time he was hacked, and he was hacked. I don't know if you remember that from Amazon, and he was claiming that he was hacked. The only person they give number was MBS from Saudi Arabia. So I guess if you are within the app, you can hack it. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to hacking, who knows? It seems like, depending on who you listen to, everything is hackable. But then you hear a few people saying, no, these apps like Signal, maybe not so much. But it's hard to believe. I will remain a skeptic that any of these apps are truly unhackable because if someone created them, somebody can certainly figure out a way into them. So I remain a little concerned about the idea, and it just feels odd. Maybe I'm too old fashioned. Maybe I'm becoming old. Maybe, Signal, there's nothing wrong with using Signal. And by the way, just because Russia and Ukraine may be using Telegram, that's probably not the standard we should aspire to when it comes to top secret communications.
Absolutely. And all of us were like worried before you had that one message that you made sure before you send it that it's not to the wrong person.
Oh, well, yeah. Not only that, I mean, I don't know about you, but I look, we're all in group texts, and there is probably nowhere, and I'm sure you as a comic, there's probably nothing I would want less to get out about me than what I say among my buddies in group text messages. And I'm sure everyone listening is the same way. I mean, whether it's with your wife or your friends or your family members, we make jokes on these group texts that are, probably not the most flattering if they were to get out. And everybody's guilty of it, I think, unless maybe I'm just some deviant and I didn't realize it.
Absolutely. So what's going on? What would you like to start with? Deportation flights, deportation in general, and all that? How about that?
So, yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. I'm actually fill-in hosting for Michael Smerconish's radio show tomorrow. And a
Nice.
story, it's about it, obviously it's about a week or so old, but, really interesting to me is this administration's ability to find these sort of dusty subsections of statutes and use them to enact their policy or to carry out their policy. And recently, the administration moved to remove a lawful permanent resident, a green card holder named Mahmoud Khalil, who I should say was a student at Columbia. He was when he was arrested, he had completed classes but had not yet graduated. And they sought to remove him. And what followed was a lot of confusion by a lot of very, very educated folks. And the confusion is understandable for the grounds for removing Khalil. And a lot of folks would say things like, well, he was a member of a group that advocated for the overthrow of the government. Therefore, that's a crime. But what's really interesting about Khalil is that zero crime is alleged as a basis for removing him. Now, as a criminal defense attorney, when I do deal with the INA, the law that provides the grounds for removal, I usually deal with it in its most common usage, which is people who are convicted of a crime can be removable if they meet the definition. And there are two different types of crimes that meet that definition. The problem is figuring out in a state under its state law whether that crime meets the definition of the federal definition of a removable crime. So, crimes are usually the most common reason for someone being removable. But here's this subsection that says that someone's also removable if the Secretary of State or the Attorney General determines that there is I think the language is something like a reasonable belief that the individual presents some kind of, not even a threat, but some kind of problem, so to speak, for foreign policy. And what does that mean? And who determines it? Well, the answer is the Secretary of State or the Attorney General. But what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to be adverse to U.S. foreign policy? And in a way, the Trump administration has found a number of these sort of, maybe I'll call them loopholes, but I don't want to call them loopholes because it's a valid statutory subsection. They're not misusing it. It appears that the law plainly allows the Secretary of State or the Attorney General to remove someone if they think they're bad for foreign policy. The fact that no one's ever used it before doesn't really make that much of a difference. Same thing with the Alien Enemies Act. For a few weeks, the Alien Enemies Act has been one of the administration's grounds for removal and for taking aggressive immigration policies. And a lot of people complain, well, the Alien Enemies Act is something that dates back to 2 centuries ago. Well, that's not your strongest argument because we have a constitution and that's 2 centuries old. So you got to pick the argument that's the best. And the best argument is that Trump is saying that the Alien Enemies Act allows for people to be removed if we're at war with them. And the Trump administration has tried to say that a lot of these people are essentially invading the country and they're aligned with the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Therefore, they are a kind of invasion that is akin to war. But, the question remains, does the law require a declared war? At least the cases who have dealt with it, they seem to be always involving some kind of declared war. But on the other hand, does the statute even require that? Can the president on his own determine, hey, I decide who's invading the country, and I say that these immigrants are invading the country. Therefore, I'm going to remove them. Therefore, I'm going to take immediate measures to send them out of the country. It's fascinating that the Trump administration has found all these statutes that really, up until now, no one's really used in this way. And won't it be interesting if the courts determine that this is a lawful exercise of executive power?
Yeah, I mean, to their credit, it seems like first of all, they must be working on this for a long time to find sub laws, you know. So he probably, unlike everybody thought that he wasn't gonna win, he's probably was thinking he's going to win for a long time, because it takes time to find all these laws, you know, and sub laws, and know how to use it and have it ready, not declare it back then, but declare it at the right moment when so they seem that they have a plan, but it's a scary plan because I'm sure there is some kind of law that can be used against anybody at any moment in time.
Right. And, even that law appears to provide some kind of defense if somebody is here exercising the same rights, maybe that's free speech rights as a citizen. But, what the Trump administration is essentially doing is saying, well, if we remove them and they're gone, it's going to be a lot harder for them to raise a First Amendment defense if they're at a prison facility in El Salvador. They're gone.
Yeah.
And that is what they've done. I mean, everything about this has been, as quick as possible. And when they remove them, I mean, they're so strategic. Let me give you an example. A lot of these folks they've taken and put them down and stored them at a facility in Louisiana. Now, Louisiana, particularly the Western District of Louisiana, is a very conservative district, and you have some conservative judges down there. And these folks, detainees who want to challenge their detention, since they're not convicted of a crime, a different federal law applies, and the jurisdiction is only in the place where they're being held when they file what's called a habeas petition. So, in other words, if
Mm.
you're a regular prisoner and I handle these cases and you say, well, I think my attorney didn't give me effective assistance of counsel, so I'm going to challenge my conviction. There you file where the trial was. Hey, I was convicted in the Southern District of New York. That's where you file. But in this case, because they're detainees, a separate federal law applies, and they have to file wherever they're being detained, the geographic location. And if they keep getting moved around, that becomes really difficult. And if you move them to a place where you're going to have a favorable judge, that's even harder. I mean, what a difference between filing your habeas petition in the Southern District of New York or the District of New Jersey versus filing it in the Western District of Louisiana. That is a kind of forum shopping. That's court shopping.
Mm.
And they're doing it simply by moving and moving quickly and getting these folks to places where they have good jurisdictions. And even more ideal for the administration is getting them to South America before they can even file anything.
Yeah.
It's really, really a remarkable thing going on. I mean, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, it seems like I said, it's very organized. They have a plan. They know exactly, they expecting the challenges. They know at each step what they're going to do. Like you said, even in location wise, like they know, like it seems like it's a big, big operation behind the scenes. It's not just like, hey, we're gonna get these folks and get them up. So two questions that I have for you that I think a regular person would definitely have. The first one is, uh, illegal aliens or aliens with people here on visa or green card, do they have right to free speech?
Well, it turns out that if they're saying anything against foreign policy, then maybe not. But generally speaking, people who are here have constitutional rights, whether or not they're here lawfully. However, the mere fact that somebody may be exercising their First Amendment rights isn't going to be a talisman to protect them against removal. In other words, they may be speaking, and even if the government doesn't like their speech, they may be removable for a totally separate reason. It could be a criminal conviction. As we've learned in the last few weeks, it could be because their presence has an adverse effect on foreign policy. There, I think I got a little closer to the language that time. Another reason, for example, is are you on public assistance? That is a grounds for removal. So it really doesn't matter whether you're exercising your First Amendment rights or not. If you're on public assistance or food stamps, technically, although I'm not aware that it's ever been done, technically you're removable. And believe me, the Trump administration must be aware of that subsection as well. They haven't unleashed it yet, but they must be aware if they're aware of the foreign policy grounds. So, nothing, yes, people who are not here, people on visas, people who are not even here lawfully have Fifth Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights. So, for example, it's frequently the case that a foreign national is arrested and charged with a crime. They have a constitutional right to counsel. They get counsel. I know that. I've been appointed counsel to people who are not in the US lawfully. And so people, whether they're here or not, have constitutional rights, whether they're here lawfully or not. However, the mere fact that they're speaking will not be a force field to even if they're exercising their First Amendment rights, that will not be a force field to protect them from being removable under the INA. And that, again, that's the federal law that governs and gives the reasons why aliens might be removable. And I always use aliens because that's what the statute uses. I know that folks don't always like that word, but that's the word that the federal law uses. So to be precise, I'm saying aliens, and there are several grounds under which they're removable. The reality is most of us are just familiar with the criminal conviction grounds, but there are several others.
Hmm. All right, my second question is when a lot of times we see like, okay, this is a favorable judge, or this is the judge that leans this way. How is that like not borderline corruption, or agenda or anything like that when you know that certain
Right.
judges are for you or against you and they're supposed to be judges?
So we have an interesting system. You go back to the framers, and the framers made a very deliberate choice when it came to federal judges. Now, in state courts, a lot of judges are elected. But in federal courts, zero judges are elected. No one in the federal judiciary is elected. They are all appointed, and they're all appointed by the president. And what that means, especially in modern times, is that each president tries to appoint someone who is as far to their way of thinking as they can possibly find, but someone who will also pass Senate review. And there's a third requirement in modern times, which is find the youngest judge you possibly can. So if you're 60 and you're a federal judge and you're hoping to get elevated to the Supreme Court, it's not going to happen because of the other unique quirk that the framers put into the system, which is judges are the closest thing we have to royalty. This is a country that was founded on the principles that were very adverse to what England had in terms of a monarchy. And yet, with that in mind, they gave federal judges the closest thing to a crown that we have in our system, which is lifetime tenure. Lifetime tenure unless they die or they retire or they're impeached. And so for that reason, they did that for a very deliberate reason. They wanted judges to be totally immune to what people said about them. So when you combine that kind of immunity from public pressure with the appointment power, and really what that means is the president appoints someone who is the most Republican like them or the most Democrat like them. Judges are appointed for two things: their political skill and for their beliefs. They are appointed for their beliefs, and those beliefs are known. And so, yes, that's why you get a lot of judge shopping. And here's the thing that might surprise you. I've spent a lot of time in state courts with elected judges. I've spent a lot of time in federal courts with appointed judges. It may sound counterintuitive, but in my personal opinion, you get a much higher caliber of judge with appointed judges. In other words, maybe the people don't always get it right because, maybe elections, at least for judges, aren't as effective in getting the best person to the bench as appointments. I know that sounds crazy because there's nothing democratic about appointing federal judges at all. It's incredibly not democratic. It's they're appointed. They don't have to run for election. They're only answerable to the Senate, and usually we already know how the Senate's going to vote on a particular judge. I mean, the only close call in recent history, to my memory, was Justice Kavanaugh, and then of course Justice Bork, famously or infamously in the '80s, didn't make it to the Supreme Court, was voted down. But they aren't really subjected to that much scrutiny, and they serve for life. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's true that judges' political leanings are always known, and they're rarely just in the middle because they were appointed by presidents who appointed them because of their political acumen. I mean, let's make no mistake about it. It's not a meritocracy. To some degree, it is. You got to have you got to have the resume that gets you past the Senate, but it's not as if some judge is brilliant but completely politically inactive and they get plucked out of nowhere and stuck onto a federal court. These are politicians. I'll just say this last thing. Vincent Bugliosi, who died several years ago, was the prosecutor who prosecuted the Charles Manson trials. Brilliant, brilliant prosecutor. He wrote several books, and they're great reads, including one about OJ, which is a good read. But really, a brilliant observation of his is that it's strange that we give judges so much respect because judges are a combination of two things that the people distrust more maybe than any job in the world. Judges are politicians and they're lawyers. We historically don't trust politicians and we don't trust lawyers. And I am a lawyer and I've gotten a lot of those jokes at cocktail parties. But it's very interesting that, judges are both lawyers and politicians. And yet when they put on the black robe, we suddenly say, oh, you're practically a deity. You're someone I respect greatly. And I do respect judges, but, they are human. And in federal court, they're humans who have been very good at politics and their political beliefs are very well known, or else they would never get appointed.
That was awesome analyzation of the situation. I think like it's crazy because you'll find like, oh, a federal judge did this or federal judge did that, and like how are they like so different? One judge will say something and the other will say the exact opposite.
Yep.
It's crazy. Do you feel like the times that we live in right now, or this presidency it seems, I mean, I know that Trump is a media guy and he's a very entertainer, and he's been in entertainment business for a long time. So he likes to do everything with the show around him. But do you feel
Yep.
like this administration have more legal stuff? Because it seems to see you guys on TV all the time analyzing stuff. Or this is always the case, it's just not as entertaining when Trump is not on.
Well, here's the difference I see between Trump 1 and Trump 2 administration. Trump 1, the administration was cobbled together in the last minute because I don't think even Trump expected to win. I think he was as surprised as anyone that he became the president. And what followed for 4 years was they didn't have a team in place. So he had to draw from establishment and the institutions. And these were people who bucked against what he wanted done. And that's why you saw all this chaos during the first Trump administration. Well, during the Biden administration, Trump built up some steam. He built up some momentum, and by the time he got elected the second time around, everybody, you notice that everybody is in lockstep with him. He's not firing 10 people a week like he did during the first administration.
Yeah.
He pre-screened all these folks in advance. I mean, he had, by the time Trump was elected the second time around, a lot of people in the establishment were Trumpers. When he was elected the first time, there were no people who were fans of Trump. I mean, his running mate was Mike Pence. I mean, that's not a guy who was a household name. Sure, he was the governor of Indiana. I'm not belittling him, but even that was seen as sort of a bit of career suicide. And so, Trump had nobody who was aligned with his way of thinking. By the time Trump 2 came around, everybody during the primaries came and basically kissed the ring and said and swore allegiance. So everybody is on the same page. It's pretty, you can call it diabolical, you can call it brilliant, either one. He has, this guy is like the Phoenix. I mean, you can arrest him, you can convict him, you can do whatever you want, but here he is, he's back, and now he's got a bunch of people who are completely in lockstep with him. Don't forget, Marco Rubio was
Yeah.
someone he called Little Marco, and arguably ended Rubio's debate, or I don't remember if it was Trump or somebody else. I think actually it might have been shoot, I can't remember her name now. She's in the administration. I'm getting old,
Tulsi,
but yeah, right. Tulsi Gabbard, right. I was getting mixed up with Nikki Haley for a second. But Tulsi, I believe, was the one who they say ended Rubio's run by catching him on the debate stage. But that's old news. But remember, Marco Rubio and Trump hated each other, and now Marco Rubio is like a Trump acolyte. So he's a great example of the establishment that was very against Trump, and now a lot of these people have come around and they're totally on board. It's crazy.
it's definitely a unique style of leadership, and it has to do a lot with Biden and Democrats obviously leaning a certain way to get everybody else to like be on board. But it seems like there's also a lot of rewards with following Trump these days. Especially that he's a one-term president. So it's
Well,
kind of
sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, if you mean there are probably a lot of people sort of, I can think of a few different people who are probably thinking about the next administration. But I mean, what's really remarkable is the speed at which this administration moves, and everybody seems to be on the same page. And people who might not have even been huge Trump fans at the beginning or during the first term have kind of pivoted into being huge fans. I mean, where do you get an RFK Jr.? I mean, who would have imagined he would have been in the administration? I mean, this is a
Yeah.
guy who probably, I mean, these are not people you would have
Or
expected, but
any administration, not just this one.
right. No, I know. But, I think Trump saw something, and I read this somewhere, and I thought this was a very good observation that RFK appealed. And, I don't know if it's true or not, but it was thought that RFK appealed to a lot of suburban moms who worry about the nutrition that their kids are getting. And, whether you want to call him an anti-vaxxer or anything else, he's a guy who's talking about, chemicals in food and bad things we eat. And, I know it sounds silly, but he's 70 plus and he's more ripped than you and I. Like he
Yeah.
must know something. Now, you and I all, I mean, I also know that you can get ripped by doing a ton of illegal steroids. So, I
Yeah.
mean, you can be incredibly unhealthy. Look at all the wrestlers from our youth who are now dead, who were like more jacked than Schwarzenegger. And so I don't know that having huge muscles is necessarily a sign of perfect health. But, I think he may have appealed when he figures out to bring RFK on board. I think he gets a lot of those suburban moms that were described in whatever article I was reading that worry about things like nutrition. And Trump is really, really good at that. I mean, you can't look at Trump's tweets and his public statements and not say, hey, here's a guy who doesn't really grasp the English language so much. But maybe that's part of his magic is that, he conveys this sort of folksy, I can barely spell, I don't know grammar thing. But meanwhile, he seems to be making these decisions that are after in retrospect kind of diabolically brilliant. I mean, it's amazing. We've been looking at Trump for a decade now, and still I feel like no one's figured him out. Maybe no one ever will.
Yeah, absolutely. He is though, and I always said that have the personality of a stand-up comedian. He's funny, he's
Absolutely.
comebacks, he thinks outside the box. It's he says something like one of the best, compliment I got for like Dave Attell, and Dave Attell's a brilliant comic, is
Oh,
like they say
huge
to
fan.
make you laugh, he makes you laugh from a different part of the brain that you didn't even know that it existed. Like it's like, how did this idea never even cross my mind? You know,
Yep.
and I feel Trump does a lot of these like look at Megyn Kelly, like the first debate, very famous, like only
Yep.
Rosie O'Donnell thing, and now she's full board. Like, you know, um, did you watch the Steve Bannon interview with what's his name, Como? Um,
I have not seen that yet. No, I have not seen the Bannon interview yet. But can I go back real quick to what you're talking about Trump? There were two moments before the election where I rarely feel like I know who's going to win. This time I was sure Trump was going to win it, and it was two different moments. The first was I was up in Larchmont, which is, for those folks not from the area, Larchmont is sort of one of the ritzy suburbs of New York. And I'm with with a friend's wife at a party, and this is someone who went to a very liberal university from a very liberal part of the world, and you would have expected her to hate Trump more than anybody else in the world. Suburban mom, and she was. I've never known her to be political. She was absolutely for Trump, and in that moment, I kind of realized I think there are a lot of people who are not open about supporting Trump who are supporting Trump, and they're invisible because they kind of hide.
yeah,
The second moment was I was with my nephews who are 15, and one of them was doing a spot on impression of Trump, and just everybody's laughing. And I started realizing among young people that something amazing had happened in the last couple of years. All my life, Hatem, I don't know if you felt this way as well, but all my life, the Democrats were cool and the Republicans were lame. They were, prudish. They were the party of no fun. They were Republicans were always the, literally socially conservative party. Bill Clinton played the sax. Obama was super cool. He played
yeah,
basketball. Like, all these Democrats were always cool. And in that moment, I realized among the young people, something had changed. And now Trump was cool. And I even said, do you mean you guys like him because he's corny and it's funny? And they said, no, we like him because he basically flips off everybody in the establishment and he keeps winning. And it's like, boy, from the mouth of babes, they really had some good observations. And in that moment, I kind of realized, wow, he's got the young vote and he's got the suburban mom vote, and it's over.
yeah. No, absolutely. And I agree with you 100%. There's a lot of like undercover Trump supporters that, maybe the first time, the second time they came out more and being like,
Yes.
listen, why not try? But a lot of times you see uh, moments like the one you mentioned, but also like for me, like he was going after any and every vote. Like, for example, when you see him, like he went to the Libertarian Party, one of the thing, and he promised a release of Russ Albright and stuff like that, like a couple of things that which we have Lynn Albright here in this show from Silk Road before. um so he got them, RFK, when he went to Michigan for the Arab and Muslim community, when he go to the Jewish community, and he seems to have this thing with when he talked to everybody, they believe him, they believe the promises
Yeah.
he made, even
Yeah,
though
how
he
do you go? How do you go talk to the Muslims? How do you go talk to Chaldeans in the Detroit area, and then go talk to a Jewish group and convince both of them? That's impressive. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
how does he do that? Like, and how does he answer questions? And by the way, when he gets stuck with a tough question, he never answers it, and nobody cares.
Yeah,
Nobody
yeah,
cares. Everyone's like,
yeah,
ah, it's just Trump.
yeah. No, absolutely. And he was just like, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. Like he went from Detroit to a meeting to another meeting with the Jewish community, and like, it's like, oh, it's fine. I'm just gonna end it. He doesn't, the thing is, like, I think even with the Arab community, like when I was asking a lot of people, like, why did you vote or why do you trust? It's like at least he's gonna say that he hates us. He's just gonna say it. He's not gonna pretend something and not do it. Uh, but he made a lot of good deals. However, obviously there's a lot of backlash and a lot of bad deals that's happening right now. You know, are you worried at all about the future or near future of free speech, freedom of speech, and all that, especially for
Uh,
in America not being America? Like you saw the video of yesterday of that student, the
the
PhD,
female student.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
detained. When you see stuff like that, like this is a third world country shit. Like this is not America.
No, I agree. I mean I agree in that those videos they're scary because these are not obviously people who are bank robbers. But I mean at the same time, I really try to look at everything objectively. And I here when I worry, here's what I worry about. I worry that we're getting into isolationism. And if you look historically, isolationism has never been good for countries in general. And then, I do see parallels, and I hate to say this, but I do see parallels with, the with pre-World War II Germany. That concerns me as well. That kind of, nationalism was what gave rise to some really bad ideas. That concerns me as well. But when you look at it, what the administration says, look, Marco Rubio says, well, look, people who are here on a student visa are here with permission. They're here at our pleasure. And in my view, I think the administration may have made a mistake. I think it might have been better to go after, MS-13 and remove those folks and then move on to the Columbia students. Maybe start with the guys with the face tattoos. And I mean, by the way, that was something I thought went very well for the administration
Yeah.
when they showed these videos of people with the face tattoos getting taken out of the country. That's a good look. The video you just talked about, where some student is accosted by in a very scary way by people who are not really displaying badges or wearing uniform and hustled into a van or wherever they take her. I think that's not great optics. And I don't know. I mean, maybe that's what the Trump administration intends to do. Maybe they intend to convey the idea that they mean absolute business. But yeah, I do worry about things like the tariffs. I worry about the isolationism. Isolationism has never been a good policy. At the same time, you can go too extreme globalist on the other end of the spectrum. I can see that being a problem. I mean, the idea we don't want a situation where the country isn't a country. But at the same time, I don't know that we want to, wall ourselves off from the rest of the world by tariffs and by escorting everyone who's not a national, not a lawful permanent resident off the premises. So yeah, I mean, I do have some concerns, but I'm not. I try not to be as alarmist because in many ways the first Trump administration was more chaotic, and here's the thing, Hatem, that I kind of rail against over and over again. We were all saying the same stuff 7 years ago. In 2017, we were all saying the same things. And I went on air on Morning Joe and said the same thing, that, we're talking about a constitutional crisis. I did one of those Google searches where all you can just have to set the date range. And I looked in the year 2017. And would you be surprised that there were many articles talking about how we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis? And a constitutional crisis, to me, implies that there's some kind of something apocalyptic coming, not just that we have a crisis and it passes. I mean, a constitutional crisis is an insurmountable event to me. And everybody was claiming that back in 2017. Heck, I probably said it once or twice on air. And now we're doing it again. So I'm a little reluctant to be too alarmist because I was probably part of the pack that did this in 2017, and we survived.
Yeah.
We didn't. The country didn't implode, and so this time around, the chaos. It's not quite as chaotic as it was the first time around. So I'm cautiously optimistic. But I mean, as you said, obviously, it's concerning some of these videos, and do I think that students who are maybe not part of groups that we are happy that they're part of, are they the first people we should be tossing out of the country? Probably not. I thought they did a better job, when they're saying it's, MS-13 and that's what we're getting out of here.
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to argue with that? And so, yeah, I'm with you. There's some things that aren't being done the best way, but maybe that's what the Trump administration intends, and maybe Trump supporters love it.
Yeah, I have three quick thoughts. I'll share all the stuff that you were saying. The first thing is, like, I think that yes, anybody broke the law should be punished by the law. But like I said, who we starting with, and the other thing is, like, with specifically this is I feel like it's the same thing with the DOGE. If you look anywhere, you're gonna find corruption and you can cut expense. Even in this
Right.
podcast, I can look and I can find something and fire someone, and
Sure.
save and somebody's not doing something. But it's the way that's done. The empathy. There's no empathy in the way they do stuff. Same thing with going after the students or stuff like that. Are you able? Did they break the law? Probably they did. But this is and that leads me to the second point, was like signs from third world countries and dictatorship, which I'm very
Yes.
familiar with. And you
Sure.
always find
Sure.
stuff like that. They have an agenda. They will take that person, then look for laws that support that. It's like, we'll deal with that later. The first thing is, like, let's make the point. Let's make everybody scared. And this is not what I like. And to your point with isolation, I totally agree with it. And the worst thing about isolation is not only that it's going to isolate us from everybody else. Everybody else is going to start feeling like, you know what? We don't need to be dependent on the US. We got to
Yeah.
start our own shit now.
Right.
So you're going to find,
Right.
instead of us leading in everything, now people are going to say, like, wait a minute, I got to start my own shit now. I have to take responsibility. But empathy, and this is what took me. There's this article, I think it was in the Times, about like how most Americans that even voted for Trump think about DOGE. And we all, to Trump credit, there's nothing that he done that he didn't say he was going to do, so that. But the way they were saying it, even the Trump, is like the empathy, the way they fire people, the way they like, for me, like, why do you start with Social Security and stuff? Why don't you start with the Department of Defense? You're going to be a hero,
Right. Right.
and the third thought is, like, it reminded me when you, like, said, like, oh, in the 20s there was the constitution crisis and everything. They found, this is one of my favorite stories. They found back in one of the Egyptian tombs, back in the pharaohs, they found a letter, and they translated, and the letter was talking to a guy who was talking, this is back in the pharaohs when they put the pyramids, and around that time, hundreds of years before PC. And he's saying in the letter that the prices are so high, and people are becoming, like, so mean. Everything that we say these days,
Oh
we
yeah.
said for thousands of years. And he was saying, like,
Yep.
life is expensive. Expensive. I'm worried about the future for my kids. We did just fine as human beings. So this is
Yeah.
thousands of years ago. So, but what I do worry about is, the dictatorship. I'm not worried that we're going to be dictatorship. I'm just worried about, and honestly, what worries me more is who's gonna come after Trump. Because if a Democrat take after Trump, he's gonna try to be, or she's gonna try to be, like, all the way to the right, which is, it's not what we need. That's what got us here in the first place. So we need a real leadership. That's what I feel. But that article about DOGE and people, like, just not liking because the empathy reason is, I think it's huge. Speaking of DOGE, what's your thoughts on that? And legal thoughts?
So, I go back to what my colleague Scott Jennings, I don't know if you've seen him on CNN. I mean, he is just whether you agree with him or not, he is really a force of nature on CNN. He's a Republican commentator. And he's kind of gotten me into my head. I don't know if he originated it, but this 80-20 idea that, Trump superpower is finding the issues that 80% of the country is totally behind and 20%, maybe a vocal 20%, is against. And the thing about DOGE is that there are plenty of things to criticize about the idea of whatever these 21-year-old people with the goofy name handles that are in charge of going through and cutting out all this government waste. But I try to think about, I spent a lot of my years in a rural part of Michigan, and I know a lot of those folks there. And I always try to think about what they would say. And I think they would love it because they think of, DC as this faraway place that spends all their money. And I think, for example, I heard Scott Jennings say this, and I thought this was a fair point, that when people are saying, oh, these, poor federal employees are losing their jobs, it is sad. It's sad anytime people lose their jobs. But Scott Jennings pointed out, well, nobody on the left was concerned during COVID when they shut down all these small businesses. Small businesses couldn't, a pizza shop couldn't remain open, or a restaurant couldn't have people come into it, and so many restaurants shut down. And of course, small businesses generate arguably a lot more tax revenue than government employees, but that shouldn't be the only factor. So these are all points that I think a lot of people supportive of Trump think everything DOGE is doing is amazing, and at least the principle is appealing to a lot of Americans. And yes, I think the criticisms are valid. Here are the criticisms I think that are valid. Is that Elon may not know what he's doing. Yeah, he's got all this tech, but I mean, how do we know what he's doing? Here are the criticisms I think are not so valid. And I've heard this a number of times that Elon Musk is unelected.
Yeah, that's
Guess
stupid.
what, folks?
Yeah.
Yeah, every human being in the executive branch is unelected except for one. There's one person who's elected in the executive branch. I'm sorry, two. There is the vice president. But everybody, Marco Rubio, all of these people, Pete Hegseth, they're all appointed. They're all unelected. And, really everyone down to the administrative agencies who are making major decisions about people's lives, they're all unelected. So the argument that Elon is unelected, not a strong argument. The argument that maybe he's not doing a good job, that he himself has admitted he makes mistakes, but these mistakes are with things like, thousands of government employees or important research issues. Those are, those are big mistakes to make. But I think the tug of war is that people are going to balance his known mistakes against the mission that a lot of Americans find appealing, at least in principle. The idea that somebody's out there actively cutting, it may make Americans feel better, even though they know he's making mistakes. And again, I go back to Scott Jennings and his 80-20 idea. And, whether they're doing it right or wrong, this whole DOGE idea is an 80-20 issue. I think 80% of the country thinks, well, I may not know the details, but that sure sounds good. And they'll ignore the whole, hey, he made a huge mistake. So I go back to Jennings. He says, this is Trump's superpower, and it is. He finds these 80-20 issues and he hammers home the messaging, whether it's right or wrong, whether he gets it right or wrong. The messaging is what I think matters. So I mean, that's my take on DOGE. I mean, I think like a lot of Americans, we like the idea in principle, but there seem to be some issues with how it's happening.
Yeah, I think the idea itself is brilliant. I mean, this is, the core of any even small business is more than how much you make, which is important, but how much you can cut expenses, and do the exact same thing. And that's how you actually make money and save money and stuff like that. I just, again, with the like, I think my only two things that for me that I don't like, and again, when we say like all the people say like, oh, Musk is not elected, this is such a stupid argument that it takes away from any good argument anybody can make.
Right.
But I think just like we said, the MS-13 and the college students, which one should be for, which one is more important right now? It's the same thing. It's like take one administration that, that people like there's a lot of fraud in it or spending or waste or whatever, but also take one that's untouchable. Like I would believe that you're gonna drain the swamp if you go to the Department of Defense or if you go to the Department of, certain things like that. But when you cut, like for example, the vaccines, which they did yesterday in the poorest country, children vaccine for poorest country, I don't get that. You know, if it's really, I mean, again, we don't have all the information. It could be that they're giving the money to countries that have a lot of corruption, and the kids don't end up getting the vaccine anyway.
Right.
So if
Right.
that's the case, that's fine. But
Right.
not
But
we have to lead in everything.
yeah, but I'm glad you bring that up. Let me give you an example. What you just mentioned with vaccines. So, Hatem, you're a worldly guy. You're, sophisticated guy, and and what you're saying makes a lot of sense. But think about a guy in rural Michigan who finds out that his taxpayer dollars are going for vaccines for people in other countries. And the sentiment I often hear is, well, what about the people here? We have people that need help. So I think you make a totally good point. I totally hear you. And this isn't even my position. I'm not taking the position of the rural dude in Michigan, but Trump knows that that guy is going to be totally on board with that message, whether there's more to the story or not. The idea that people, and I remember when I lived in rural Michigan, I used to hear people talk about like how, DC is this faraway place. They're taking our money, and that's going to be an easy sell. Yes, we want kids to have vaccines, but the second part of that sentence for a lot of these people is always going to be, hey, well, what about back here? We have sick kids here as well. So that, I mean, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying that, you make a great point. But again, going back to those 80-20 issues, Trump has figured out a way to market his ideas to those people who fill out the large swaths of this country that people fly over in airplanes, that they like those ideas. They
Well,
like the idea of it.
yeah, I totally understand that, but I think if it's a choice either or, of course we want to start with ourselves.
Yep.
We can't
Yeah,
go build
sure.
highways and we don't have highways. But the thing is, like we have enough of both, you know. And the other
Right.
argument that I heard, and it was actually a very interesting and smart idea. I know I have to go in a couple of minutes. Um, was if Elon, let's say Elon Musk was in the Israeli government right now doing the DOGE thing, and he looked at a company is like, oh, look at this. We spending all this money to build pagers. Who the fuck use pagers anymore? Cut. But turns out to be an operation that killed all the
Hmm.
Hezbollah stuff, you know?
Hmm.
So I understand that he doesn't have all the clearance, he doesn't understand stuff like that, but there's some stuff that, that maybe he doesn't know, he doesn't have clearance to. So, it's a nice. However, the Doge idea, I remember, I don't know if you heard it in Rogan first, and then the live between Trump and Elon Musk. The first time Elon Musk
Oh
came up
yeah.
with that idea, it was brilliant. I was like,
Yeah.
God, I
Yeah.
mean, this is exactly what's going to get him elected, you know?
Yeah. The idea, maybe not the execution. The execution might even end up being poor, but people love the idea.
Yeah,
They love
yeah,
it. They
yeah.
love it.
I mean, I'm afraid that no one's gonna hire Musk to get Doge in the comedy cellar and be like, cut the expenses here. And we
Right.
it's like first
Yeah.
expenses, Hatem doesn't come here anymore. I gotta save a lot of money with
That's
that.
right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Oh man.
yeah, but any legal issue with Doge at all, you think?
So, I mean, Doge is being challenged as sort of as exceeding the power. So, for example, I mean, one of the challenges to Doge has been that he's Elon Musk has gone beyond being a mere private advisor and acting as the government without lawfully being part of the government. That's a challenge currently pending. I mean, all these challenges are basically working their way through the courts. So yes, absolutely, there are legal challenges to the idea of Elon Musk just sort of remaining a private individual and just doing whatever he wants. The way the administration is couching it to protect themselves is to make him sort of just an advisor. But you don't just get to call someone an advisor if that's not actually what they are. So that's one of the pending challenge, one of the many, 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 many court challenges to things the administration is doing.
Absolutely. Always great to have you, Danny. And this is
Thank you. It went so fast,
I
Hatem.
know, I know. It's and this is what I think. I invite everybody to have a conversation like this. It's like where you really understand both sides, and not just like one side be like, oh shit, like this is bad, this is good. Try to understand it. I hope
Sure.
we do stuff with more empathy. But Danny, always great to talk to you.
Oh, thank you
Hope we
so
can do it
much. It's
outside of here soon. Maybe tomorrow I'll text you. But yeah.
yes.
If people want to follow you, and you gotta follow him on Twitter, you gotta watch his shows. Is your podcast back live or no?
It's not back live. It's on hiatus, but I do have a Substack, Brief Legals, Twitter, Cevallos Law, and I'll plug my wife's new magazine, Switchboard Magazine. Fantastic long form stories that you should check out. Switchboard Magazine.
Would love to have Sarah on the show soon too. She's so much fun as well.
Oh, she's great. She's great. I will mention that to her. She loves you guys.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Danny. Have a great time. Live from America
All right,
podcast.
buddy.
Normless.